Welcome to the Knowledge Seeker channel. The channel is dedicated to exploring critical issues in the world. The title of this presentation is Ijaw Just War Principles and Practices. The purpose of this presentation is to achieve three goals. 1. Explore the Ijaw warrior tradition. 2. Discuss the relationship between war and spirituality. And 3. Identify the areas of the warrior tradition that constitute a just war doctrine. It should be noted that this presentation draws upon the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial Ijaw warrior practices to develop the Ijaw Just War Doctrine. Now, let's look at the relationship between Ijaw nationality and Urukarism. The Ijaw nationality is one of a few ethnic groups in Africa that is fiercely independent due to a spiritual culture that is embedded in its indigenous religion. As a result, Urukarism is the foundation for Ijaw nationalism. Hence, whenever the Ijaws are aroused to take action to correct or eradicate injustice and ensure their existence, they become very spiritual by relying more on their religious culture. In a high state of spiritual consciousness, they become one with the water and the forest to the extent that the impossibility becomes possible. Due to the fact that Ijaw nationalism is tied to their religion, they cannot separate themselves from the religion of their ancestors, which is Urukarism. The Ijaw nation is made of about 90% Christians and 100% Urukaris, although most people are likely to say that there are Christians at the surface. Urukarism is derived from Urukare, the worshipping of a deity. The deity is God and the associated godly entities that make up the Ijaw wall of God, spirituality, and mysticism. Now, let's look at the relationship between Urukarism and the rules of war. Since Ijaw culture is very spiritual, Urukarism has a powerful influence on the way the Ijaws view and fight wars. Hence, the Ijaws have well-articulated principles, rules, and practices regarding conducting a war. To initiate and fight a war, it is necessary to adhere strictly to the spiritual principles and practices. The Ijaw war principles, rules, and practices constitute a just war doctrine. In other words, the Ijaws have developed stringent rules that must be followed when fighting a war. To understand Ijaw Just War principles and practices, it is necessary to briefly explain the global concept of just war doctrine that was initially developed in the West but has been universalized. The core of Western just war doctrine that has been globalized is embedded in 1. Jus ad bellum, and 2. Jus in bello. 1. Jus ad bellum. This is a requirement that the total good necessitated by war should outweigh its total evil. Therefore, if the total evil incurred by war outweighs the total good, then the war is illegal or unjustified. Now, 2. Jus in bello. This is a requirement that the destruction caused to civilians in fighting a war must be proportionate to the significance of the military objectives. In other words, if too many civilians and non-combatants are killed in any war, then that war could be considered to be unjustified. Let's then look at the Ijaw principles and practices that constitute jus ad bellum and jus in bello. This globally accepted doctrine of just war is used to arrange the presentation here in order to universalize the Ijaw Just War Doctrine. This means that the areas of Ijaw Just War principles and practices that are compatible with the jus ad bellum are placed under that category. On the other hand, the areas of the Ijaw Just War principles and practices that are compatible with the jus in bello are placed under that category to enhance the understanding of Ijaw military principles, rules, and practices. In this section, Ijaw beliefs and practices that are compatible with jus ad bellum are identified and explained. So let's go step by step. 1. Gaining approval before going to war. The Ijaws cannot fight a war without first contacting their ancestors and deities due to the spiritual contract that exists between the living and the ancestors to determine the justification for fighting a war. Why? There are many reasons. A. According to the Ijaw religious belief system, the world is divided into two, namely 1. The world of God, spirituality, mysticism, and 2. The world of physicality and materialism. B. Of the two worlds, the world of God is superior to the world of physicality and materialism. The reason is that it is the world of God that gave birth to the physical and material world. So the material physical world depends on the spiritual world. See, therefore, whatever the living decide to do, they must first consult with the spiritual world in order to be in compliance with their religious tenets. Why? A certain aspect of the Urukari religion tends to reinforce the view that that is, the Ijaws are the children of God and have a special compact with God. Due to the compact, God gave them a Besu and other powerful godly deities that are equivalent to archangels or subcategories of God to protect them against threats and harm. As a result, they cannot take any action that violates the order of God. The need to be in compliance with the godly order compels Ijaw fighters to be initiated into secret warrior societies in order to be one with God. Hence, Chief Asari Dokubo stated, 99% of Ijaw people believe in Egbesu. Only a fraction, indicating less than 1% of us believe in Christianity or Islam or even other persuasions. 99% of Ijaw fighters will not go out if they are not carrying Egbesu. And that is a very strong statement about the extent of Ijaw spirituality in fighting a war. This is the case always, regardless of whether the Ijaw soldiers are well trained in modern warfare or not. Hence, the Ijaws always carry out spiritual consultations to gain approval and support for prosecuting a war. They do so to avoid fighting an unjust war. Consequently, the Ijaw nationality is only one of a few ethnic groups in the African continent that always fight wars using both physical and spiritual means. Spiritual means involve the strict obedience to the godly beliefs and practices necessary to receive the manifested protection of the ancestral deities and God. It further means receiving the appropriate training in mysticism, upholding the sacred rules, praying, pouring libation, and invoking the godly entities to intervene and protect the individual fighter from harm while being able to inflict a mortal blow to the enemy. The process is akin to being a warrior monk. Thus, Ijaw sacred warriors are like warrior monks. Generally, it appears that sacred rules forbid Ijaws from acquiring magical concoctions, that is, okpo, in Nigerian Pidgin English, through native doctors and other specialists. The reason is that it is strongly believed that godly power, which comes as a miracle, is more potent than magical power. Hence, the Ijaws tend to say that any individual who comes into their territory with magical power to cause harm shall not succeed, because the godly entities that permeate Ijaw land will neutralize such an artificial power. Following the same logic, any fighter who confronts an Ijaw sacred fighter with a magical potion will not succeed, since Egbesu and other deities of war would neutralize such things, since God's is superior to any other force on earth. 2. Non-ideological orientation to war. Due to the spirituality of Ijaw approach to war, the Ijaws are obligated to be non-ideological in dealing with issues of war and peace. This means that the decision to fight or not fight depends on the circumstances. If the circumstances change, they must also change. There are many examples and reasons to give. A. They must closely watch and analyze the behavior of the enemy. If the enemy attacks or provokes them without any reason, they are obligated to fight back and destroy the enemy. B. If the enemy changes behavior, then the Ijaws too must change behavior to accommodate the new behavior of the enemy. See, even in the thick of battle, if the enemy decides to stop fighting, the Ijaws too must reciprocate and stop fighting to avoid engaging in an aggressive or unjust war. D. If the enemy is willing to negotiate, regardless of the degree of harm caused, the Ijaws too must try to accommodate the negotiation. However, if the enemy is uncompromising and takes the war path, then the Ijaws will go all out by invoking and deploying their spiritual means to overwhelm the enemy, both militarily and spiritually. 3. War of aggression. Under the Ijaw Just War Doctrine, the Ijaws cannot engage in a war of aggression because it goes against the order of God. In other words, they cannot attack another group without provocation. And there are many reasons to show why. A. An attack without provocation cannot be spiritually justified since it violates the sacred order of God. Hence, those Ijaws who engage in criminal conduct cannot utilize the protective umbrella of the deities. B. In such a criminal or aggressive war, the godly entities cannot be invoked for protection. So people who engages in criminal warfare are more likely to rely more on native doctors and magical powers rather than on spiritual or miraculous powers. See, thus, Igbesu and other major war deities can only be invoked to fight a war of self-defense and not to engage in a war of aggression. 4. Self-defense. The Ijaws are obligated to fight a war as a means of defending themselves from aggression. Aggression involves circumstances whereby an outside entity tries to usurp land, impose political, economic, and military power without justification, take or exploit resources without obtaining permission to do so, cheat and create conditions that make the situation unbearable for the Ijaws to exist, and kill members of the ethnic group in an unprovoked manner. There are many reasons to cite from. A. Thus, they can only fight using spiritual means if they are fighting to prevent or stop aggression against them. B. Additionally, an Ijaw person cannot kill for the sake of killing, and neither can one kill for the purpose of enriching oneself or thwarting the progress of another. Thus, this is why it is forbidden to engage in ritual killing of another human being. This is also why money rituals are a rarity in Ijaw land. It is considered a serious abomination to do so. See, in war, women and children cannot be killed except if they are part of the enemy force that is targeting the Ijaws. Thus, only enemy fighters are the target of elimination, when fighting as a sacred Ijaw warrior or fighter. Therefore, the Ijaw sacred fighter cannot engage in a war of aggression because the ancestral forces will take away the protection of spiritual invisibility. If the fighter violates the rule, war must strictly be for self-defense. 5. Retaliatory and retributive and punitive wars. Apart from fighting in self-defense, it is justifiable to fight a retaliatory and punitive war against an enemy that instigated a war of aggression by attacking or provoking the Ijaws. Such a war is intended to send a clear message that if attacked or provoked beyond a tolerable degree, the Ijaws will retaliate and punish the offender to stop the opponent from repeating the aggressive action again. Thus, an unwritten code of conduct exists for the punishment of those who engage in aggressive acts. An eye for an eye punishment is called for. This was very prevalent during the colonial days. For instance, in the case of murder, the violator could be punished by the immediate family of the violator, or he or she could be handed over to the family of the victim for punishment and or tried in a communal court system, or be killed outright. To avoid war, aggressive acts like unprovoked killings, usurpation of land, and destruction of property require the compensation of the victims. If compensation is not paid, then retaliation is justifiable. Revengeful retaliation is a possibility if the solutions offered are considered unsatisfactory or insufficient to satisfy the community of the victims. It should also be noted that the Nembe invasion, which is characterized as the Akasa raid against the Royal Niger Company in 1895, was a retaliatory and punitive attack to stop the Royal Niger Company from the destructive economic tactics that threatened trade in the area. The nonchalant way Nigeria treats Ijaw land and the oil region in the modern era is very similar to the way the Royal Niger Company treated Ijaw land in the past. This means that Nigeria is being unjust to the people of the Niger Delta by exploiting the oil wealth without sufficient compensation and the cleansing or cleaning of the massive pollution inflicted on the territory. So for the Ijaws, that is an unjust war or an aggression that Nigeria is carrying out against Ijaw land. 6. Last resort. Under the Ijaw sacred war tradition, war is an instrument of last resort. This means that the Ijaws must try and exhaust every possible peaceful means of de-escalating a crisis, including negotiations. If the other side continues to be provocative and insightful through threatening actions, then the Ijaws have no other option than to engage in warfare to settle the matter. Therefore, Among the Ijaws, war is always a last resort mechanism to resolve political crises. This is why the Ijaws always plead for an understanding so that a situation does not escalate into warfare. Quite often, when the Ijaws plead for an understanding, others view it as a sign of weakness and continue the provocative action. Quite often, the warnings are ignored due to the assumption that because the Ijaws are humble and laid back in their approach to political circumstances, they are weak and passive. As a result of this wrong assessment of Ijaw behavior, they further assume that they can literally walk over the Ijaws and do as they wish. When the Ijaws react like a tornadic force to show their martial character, they are shocked by the ferocity of the reaction. They often do not realize that the Ijaws have a well-established martial tradition that can easily be mobilized against any force that threatens their interests. The Ijaws rarely show their martial character because the Urukari religion calls for humility, respect, justice, fairness, law, order, regard for others, and harmony. These virtues are similar to the Egyptian Mahad. This is why the Ijaws generally do not hustle, tell tall tales, exaggerate their self-importance, and claim that they are superior to other people. However, when they are provoked to an intolerable degree, then their martial spirit will take over. 7. Warning before action is taken. Part of the Ijaw Just War Doctrine is that they must inform their opponent or enemy or whoever is threatening them to stop the offending or provocative behavior. As a result, the Ijaws always issue a warning and hope that the other side will stop perpetrating a provocative or threatening or exploitative act. Unfortunately, it is always the case that the other side often underrates the Ijaw ability to strike back like a cobra. There are many examples to cite from to show this behavior. A. Starting from the 15th century, when the Ijaws felt that Europeans were violating their territory to trade with other ethnic groups by bypassing them, they warned repeatedly before resorting to military action to stop European violation of their territory. B. When the business practices of the Royal Niger Company threatened their means of economic livelihood, they warned repeatedly. The failure to listen resulted in the Akasa raid in 1895. C. Bonny refused to allow entry into his territory in territorial waters during the pre-colonial and colonial period. D. King Jaja made sure European traders did not tamper with the territorial integrity of his Opopo territory. E. The Agbere, Sabagria, Odi, and many other Ijaw communities militarily resisted British colonization and trade. F. The Ijaw resistance was so intense that a British colonial official considered that the Ijaws had not been conquered. J. Hostilities were reduced only after Ijaw leaders decided to sign the Treaty of Friendship and Protection in 1884-1885 with the British before the gradual colonization of Nigeria began in the Niger Delta region. H. When Nigeria wanted to dredge the River Niger Forcados without conducting an effective environmental impact assessment to determine the impact on the ecology, ecosystem, and communities living along the river, the coordinator of the Ijaw Monitoring Group, Comrade Joseph Eva, and Ijaw warned that any effort to dredge the river without meeting certain conditions would amount to wanton subjugation, deprivation, and oppression of an already suppressed people living in a grossly degraded environment. That was clearly telling Nigeria to think twice and do the needful. I, in the early 1960s, the Ijaws felt highly marginalized and balkanized since they could not exercise power in their own territory, since they were carved into other regions. The Ijaws won and expected Nigeria to ameliorate the unacceptable condition. The failure led to the Isaac Adakaboro Rebellion and the declaration of the Niger Delta Republic in February 1966. J. The exploitative situation repeated itself in the 1990s, and the Ijaws warned repeatedly about the unacceptable injustice being perpetrated against them and other ethnic groups in the oil region. Despite repeated warnings, Nigeria and the oil companies continued as if the warnings meant nothing. They might have probably rationalized that the Ijaws cannot and could not bite. Care. Suddenly, the failure to heed the warnings led to the emergence of the Egbesu Boys of Africa. The Egbesu Boys was followed by the Niger Delta Volunteer Force, then the Niger Delta People's Volunteer Force, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, and a host of Ijaw armed youths whose warnings had been ignored. Similarly, youths from other ethnic groups in the oil region joined the agitation, and Nigeria's oil production plummeted. As can be seen, the exploitation of the oil wealth from the Niger Delta South-South by Nigerians from the non-oil producing regions has reached an alarming stage in 2023, thereby compelling the Ijaws again to issue warnings. Hence, the coordinator of the youth from the 6 states of the South-South, that is Izoebi, explained the unacceptable situation in the oil region. Please take your time, go through it and read through. to see that it's literally, again, letting Nigeria know that the situation is becoming unbearable in the oil region. Thus, when the Ijaws warn repeatedly and a change of behavior does not take place, they will go deep into their warrior tradition and prepare physically and spiritually to confront the enemy. Therefore, it will be very wise for Nigeria to listen to what Izobe is saying and to listen very attentively to the concerns of the Niger Delta South-South youths. When they do so, they become one with their ancestors and deities. They also become one with the water and the forest so that the enemy might find it difficult to see them. It is at that stage that the impossible becomes possible. In fact, while visiting the Igbosunized fighters of the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, an American journalist named Sebastian Junger of Vanity Fair magazine described the fighters, and I quote, "They had painted their faces with white chalk to signify spiritual purity, and they had tied amulets around their arms and necks and foreheads for protection from bullets. Some had stuck leaves in their clothing so the enemy would see trees rather than men." In other words, when sanctified, the Ijaw fighters can melt into the forest and the enemy will not see them but the forest, or they can melt into the water in the river. That is what the journalist is trying to describe. This is a picture of Ijaw fighter with spiritual symbols around the body. It was the ferociousness of the fighting and the ability of the fighters to drastically reduce oil and gas production that compelled the federal government to negotiate an end to the oil war in 2009 by instituting the Presidential Amnesty Program. F. In upholding their sacred war tradition, the Ijaws even warn their enemy when they are about to launch an attack. They warn before launching an attack so that the enemy knows that they are coming. The expectation is that the other side will change its mind and avoid war by opting for negotiation. G. They also warn of their impending attack so that innocent civilians flee the area and avoid being caught in the crossfire. H. Recently, as rumors spread that the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation Limited is attempting to retire Ijaw and other Niger Delta officials and tactically replace them with people from other regions, the Ijaw Youth Council issued a warning to the NNPCL to desist from marginalizing the citizens of the oil region and replacing them with people from the non-oil producing regions. 8. To declare war. Apart from warning about the possibility of war, if an aggressive or provoking action is not stopped, the Ijaws even allow the enemy to make a choice between war and peace. In fact, in the pre-colonial era, to go to war, for instance, the Kalabari Ijaws will send a messenger or an envoy to the enemy carrying yam and gunpowder. The enemy was given the opportunity to decide whether he or she wanted peace or war by choosing either the yam or gunpowder. If the enemy chooses the yam, that was indicative of a desire to seek peace. On the other hand, if the enemy picks gunpowder, that is indicative of a preference for war. And then the Calabaris would then attack. 9. Reason of state or military necessity. The Ijaw Just War Doctrine includes a reason of state justification to engage in war in order to protect his territory. Citizens and national interests. It should be noted that since the Ijaws occupy a central zone of the Niger Delta that looks like the belly of the delta, the subregion is very strategic. Thus, to get into the interior of Nigeria through the Atlantic Ocean, Ijaw territory is the easiest and the shortest route to take, since the River Niger and its tributaries, including the River Non, goes through Ijaw land to get to the sea. As a result, foreign intrusion without permission was common in the pre-colonial days, and the Ijaws had to watch their territory like hawks watching over their chicks. In particular, European traders threatened Ijaw national interest, and the Ijaws had to be proactive in making sure that their interests were not jeopardized. They had to fight regularly to ward off invaders and those who threaten their sovereignty. There are many instances to cite to show the Ijaw effort to protect his territory. A. King Jaja of the city-state of Opobo felt that both European and indigenous traders were a threat to the economic and geopolitical interests of the state. Hence, he launched attacks to prevent the establishment of a trading post in the Kwa Ibo area. He won repeatedly before launching the attacks in April of 1881, in which 5 towns and the European-owned Watts factory were destroyed. B. The Akasa raid also had the earmarks of the reason of state consideration, since the Royal Niger Company attempted to destroy the economic base of Nembe city-state. In fact, a writer, Chigachi Eke, noted the proactive measures adopted by the Ijaws, and I quote, Ijaw trading houses had war canoes patrolling the creeks. He, King Koko, completely razed a British trading post at Akasa in 1895 before hauling 67 whites into his private prison until ransom on them were paid. The British had annoyed him by not punishing George Tubman Goldie, who stopped Ijaw merchants from exporting oil to Britain. Compare with Ijaw militancy of the 19th century. What you have today is brush fire. So that tells you how active the Ijaws were in using the reason of state or military necessity to protect their territory. See, in recent times, the Warri Wars of 1998-2003 could be said to come under the category of reason of state or military necessity because the Warri issue simmered for decades, starting from the pre-colonial period. It got to a point where the Ijaws believed that it was a military necessity to resort to arms to settle the matter, since all peaceful political and legal efforts had failed to address Ijaw concerns. The oil war, which pitted Ijaw and use of other ethnic groups in the Niger Delta South against Nigeria and the oil companies, also comes under reason of state and or military necessity. At the time, the Ijaws and the other ethnic groups felt that Nigeria and the oil companies threatened their existence. Hence, they had to fight to protect themselves as their lands were being destroyed through oil and gas pollution, expropriation of their natural rights to inherit some of the oil wealth, the massive looting of the oil wealth, the discrimination and marginalization instituted to prevent citizens of the oil region from actively participating in oil and gas exploration led the youth to wage a war of economic liberation. 10. Authority to wage war. Any justifiable war that the Ijaws fight or are expected to fight must be led by a competent or right authority. This means that the commander or leader is duly appointed through the traditional political system to lead the war effort. This is why every Ijaw clan is divided into military commands. The Ijaws refer to the political division of their clans into military divisions as war houses. Each war house is led by a warrior chief who serves as the chief commander of the community. No justifiable war can take place without a meeting of the elders of the community, including the kings, queens, council of chiefs, chief religious priests and priestesses, and the military commanders. This is a traditional war canoe led by a war chief in Okreka. 10. Authority to wage war. Thus, no war can take place without authorization, not only from the members of the living, but also from the ancestors and ancestral deities. Since it is necessary to maintain order and stability, it means that no Ijaw can fight a justifiable war without obeying spiritual as well as orders from the political and military superiors of the community. That is why orders from the superior is very important in justifying a war. In the physical realm, the kings, queens, and chiefs serve as commander-in-chiefs and commanders of the fighting forces. Thus, they have the authority to declare wars after consultation. In Ijaw land, if the ancestral deities do not approve of war, the Ijaws might decide not to fight. Similarly, any war fought without authorization from the kings, queens, and chiefs will be considered unjustified. However, while a chain of command is maintained, nonetheless, sometimes the deities can pick a fighter among the group of fighters to serve as a temporary commander to lead a particular war. This takes place when spiritual manifestation occurs and an individual is chosen spiritually among the fighters to lead a fight in the hope that none will be killed for following the spiritual instruction. When a spiritual manifestation results in recommending a particular individual to lead a particular fight, the individual selected could be an adult or a child. Again, journalist Sebastian Junger of the Vanity Fair magazine described his encounter with Egbesu fighters during the oil war by saying, leaders are often chosen by the Ijaw god of war, Egbesu, and leadership can change daily. Egbesu sometimes communicates his desires by appearing in the dreams or visions of one of his followers and instructing him to be the leader for that day. If the man tells the truth about Egbesu, others follow him without question. If he lies about it, Egbesu might kill him, unquote. The reason is that sacred fighters depend on the dictates of the godly entities. That's why they must follow the rules strictly. Now, having completed the section on just ad bellum, let's look at the sections that deals with just in bello. Proportionality deals with issues pertaining to the norms and practices concerning the conducting of war, otherwise known in the West as just in bello. This focuses on principles such as proportionality, discriminate means, and prudence. So let's look at each one of them. A. Proportionality requires that the casualties and other evils of war suffered by both sides should not outweigh the good achieved by war. In other words, if two sides fight and the war is too destructive, then such a war will be considered unjustifiable. B. Discriminate means forbids intentional military attacks against enemy civilians and other non-combatants. This means that in fighting a war, care must be taken not to inflict undue damage to the civilian population. If too many civilians and non-combatants are killed, that war will be considered unjustifiable. C. Prudence. Prudence requires the weighing of the costs and benefits of fighting a war. In other words, if a war is too destructive, then that war will be considered unacceptable. Suspending the requirement of proportionality and discriminate means principle can only take place when a situation is viewed as bordering on supreme emergency. In other words, if a state wants to go to war that borders on aggression, that can only be done under supreme emergency. That is very tricky, you know. The Ijaw Just War Doctrine includes proportionality in the conduct of just war. Now, let's look at the Ijaw view of proportionality. The Ijaws adhere to this principle both in the pre-colonial and modern eras, in the sense that wars were fought based on the level of conflict. And there are many instances to cite from. A. In the pre-colonial era, a war emanating from the killing of a member of a particular community by someone from another community, it was expected that the community of the aggressor would make arrangements with the community of the victim to settle the matter by paying compensation or agreeing to whatever terms that the community of the victim insisted. B. The fact that the enemy state was made aware of the fact that a war could ensue if certain conditions were not met meant that both sides knew the implications of fighting a bloody war. Sometimes the community from which a murderer or an instigator of a provocative incident originated might decide to surrender the culprit to the victim's community for punishment to avoid war. In other words, the community can literally hand over the offender to the community of the victims and let them decide what to do with him or her during the colonial days or pre-colonial days. Sometimes, in an unwarranted murder case, an individual from the community of the perpetrator was exchanged to substitute for the victim. However, in the modern era, this is no longer possible since the law enforcement agencies will get involved to investigate the matter. But in the pre-colonial era and during the colonial era, this was quite possible. The number of fighters in any particular war was determined by the level of the conflict. Thus, an intracommunal or intra-ethnic war could involve less fighters. Likewise, it could be less drastic compared to an inter-ethnic war. So let's look at some specific practices that have been identified and discussed. 1. Prudence. The Ijaws are very prudent in making decisions about war and peace. As stated repeatedly, their culture is embedded in spirituality, so decisions about going to war require going through an elaborate process. And there are many reasons to cite from. A. They always weigh the consequences of fighting a war before deciding whether to fight or not. B. Most often, even after they have decided to fight, they still must consult with their ancestral deities to gain approval and support to a certain degree. See, this is why it takes them a long time to react militarily because they spend a considerable time warning and pleading for the instigator to stop provoking them before the situation gets out of control. So they just spend quite a while to warn and to plead. A. The Ijaws also have a provision for indicating the location and time of combat. Generally, during the pre-colonial era, war was either fought at the boundary areas or in a designated zone between two opposing communities or entities. The rule changed depending on the level of aggression. If the enemy engaged in an unprovoked attack, then the rule concerning where to fight becomes null and void as the Ijaws try to inflict retributive justice by invading and destroying the source of provocation. B. The Ijaws allow for truces so that if the enemy wants to negotiate, such would be allowed, as indicated in the section dealing with non-combatant immunity. C. Ijaw sacred fighters are expected not to kill women and children, rape, or loot. Such behaviors will result in the forfeiture of spiritual invincibility offered by the deities. In fact, Ijaw sacred warriors are obligated to high-level spiritual rules, even more than those of Christianity and Islam. An official of the Ijaw Youth Council explained the consequences of violating the sacred rules by saying, and I quote, membership, that is to Igbesu, is not revoked. You will realize that your atrocities are becoming unbecoming, and you will also realize that you might be facing death if you are not clean. By this, I mean if you have defiled the commandments of Supreme Igbesu. Basically, any initiated Ijaw fighter who violates the spiritual rules forfeits spiritual protection and could perish. 3. Non-combatant immunity. As indicated above, Ijaw sacred warriors who operate under spiritual rules make strenuous efforts to avoid killing non-combatants, especially women and children. Hence, before launching an attack, Isaac Adakaboro advised his comrades in the Niger Delta Volunteer Service based on Ijaw war principle. And I quote, he said, "For this reason and for the good name of the Ijaws, do not commit atrocities such as rape, looting, or robbery. Moreover, you know it is against Ijaw tradition to mess about with women during war. You have been purified these many days. Be assured that if you do not get yourselves defiled within the period of battle, you shall return home safe, even if we fail." And I'll quote. So that is Boro advising his fighters that they should follow the Ijaw spiritual rules of war. During the oil war in the Niger Delta South, to avoid harming any Nigerian, the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta advised, and I quote, "Nigerians working for oil companies are warned to leave the states of the Niger Delta in their best interest. In the next few days, we will carry out a series of attacks to prove to all companies that we alone, your host, can guarantee your security. We understand and sympathize with soldiers being sent into this conflict because they are there without choice. We do not wish to kill them unless absolutely necessary. So here again, you have men warning people in advance to leave the fighting zone. Ijaw sacred fighters make strenuous efforts to encourage non-combatants to leave the vicinity of war. This is why Ijaw fighters warn repeatedly before finally launching an attack. After warning, any non-combatant that continues to remain in an area that has been marked for military attack has himself or herself to blame. This principle of war is not part of the war effort of the Boko Haram, the herdsmen, and armed bandits that operate as guerrillas in northern Nigeria. The Boko Haram kill anybody and destroy everything in their path. They also engage in rape, looting, human trafficking, and illegal drug dealing. Ijaw sacred fighters cannot engage in those kind of actions. Thus, after repeated warnings, if the other side continues its provocative action, then the Ijaws are spiritually justified to take action to ameliorate the injustice imposed on them. Unfortunately, in Nigeria, those who wield political power always assume that since they have the power to impose their will on the Ijaws, they can afford to do so without consequences. 4. Treatment of the vanquished and prisoners of war. Traditionally, the treatment of the vanquished and prisoners of war depended on the level of military escalation. The nature of the war often determines how prisoners were treated, and there are many instances to cite from. A. In the case of aggravated assault, such as in a murder case, if the community of the offender demonstrates a good faith effort by quickly contacting the community from which the victim originates and negotiates, the matter can be resolved very quickly without the entire community of the offending side being punished. B. If the family and the community of the offender refuse to settle the matter by agreeing to a negotiated settlement, the community of the victims is justified to pay back on an eye for an eye basis by capturing and killing a member of the community of the offending individual. This was common in the pre-colonial era. In the modern era, this is not likely to take place unless the provocation is beyond imagination. See, if a war involves a larger scale, then the citizens of the defeated could all be treated as prisoners of war and captured. At this level of war, every member of the opposing side is viewed as an enemy, since at such a level, almost every adult member of the society participates in the war effort one way or the other. Thus, in a large-scale war ignited due to aggressive actions during pre-colonial era, prisoners captured could be enslaved. However, due to the spirituality of Ijaw war practices, for instance, among the Calabaris, slaves were integrated into the mainstream of society through initiation into Ekine and Korogbo secret societies. Other Ijaw communities like Boni, Opobo, Nembe, and others did likewise. So the Ijaws always have a way to work to resolve a problem. In modern times, captured prisoners are most likely to be used as a bargaining tool, such as exchanging prisoners or gaining leverage. And of course, in modern times, it is necessary also to follow secular law. One noticeable tendency of the Ijaws and some ethnic groups during the pre-colonial era was that after defeating an opponent, instead of occupying the territory, the victorious fighters would retreat back to their territory. They might exact conditions that the defeated side must comply with to avoid being attacked again. For instance, MS Tepowa reported that after Kola carried out a reprisal attack against Onyoma following the killing of a prince of Kola, the Kola warriors returned back to Kola instead of occupying Onyoma. Likewise, Professor Joe Ebiegberi Alagwa also reported that in two wars waged by Bile around 1770 and 1780, the warriors returned back to their territory. The taking of life is a serious matter in Ijaw spirituality. The reason is that it is believed that when a life has been taken, the blood of the victim would affect the individual who takes the life. Thus, to avoid the spiritual backlash of taking the life of someone, Ijaw fighters are required to do spiritual cleansing to wash away the negative effect that comes in the form of post-traumatic stress syndrome. Hence, after any war, the fighters go home to perform the cleansing ritual known as clear. Any fighter who was inducted through the clear ritual dies. The Uzi ritual is performed as a last honor. Among the Kolokuma Ijaws, the Uzi ritual is performed 3 times before burial takes place of an initiated fighter who had killed during a war. It is strongly believed by many Ijaws that due to the cleansing ritual, Ijaw fighters, whether in the pre-colonial or modern era, rarely suffer from PTSD. This is why even modern Nigerian soldiers of Ijaw ancestry continue to engage in ritual cleansing of the body after fighting in a war. 5. Peace and reconciliation. As stated at the beginning of this presentation, due to the spirituality of their culture, the Ijaws are not ideologically oriented. This means that they are capable of changing their perceptions of a situation based on the dynamics. Thus, the need to fight is determined most especially by the behavior of the opponent or enemy. If the opponent decides to make peace, the Ijaws will accommodate the change and take appropriate steps to do so. As a result, two communities can go to war and later become friends if there is a behavioral change in the relationship. Similarly, even while a war is going on, if one party decides to cease hostilities, the other side will accommodate the change and act accordingly. Consequently, going to war and continuing the war largely depends on the behavior of the opponent. This implies that a party in a conflict can decide to surrender and put a stop to a war or continue to fight. Similarly, negotiations can take place while the war is ongoing. There is always room for negotiation since issues are not based on ideological configurations, but rather on spiritual principles and practicality. To end hostilities in the pre-colonial period, peace ceremonies were conducted between the parties involved in a conflict. Peace ceremonies included 1. Offering sacrifices to the deities, 2. Organizing feasts in which the two sides ate together and danced. This was followed by the signing of peace treaties, with each opponent swearing an oath never to kill or make war on each other. It should be noted that some of the peace treaties that were signed during the pre-colonial era still stand among some ethnic groups and communities in Nigeria today, including the Ijaws. The Ijaws also have a military tradition that is tantamount to fighting a holy war. The reason is that the Ijaws draw their just war principles from their religion. How? As indicated in a previous presentation titled Urukarism, the religion of the Ijaw people of the Niger Delta, the Ijaws have about 10 major national deities that are sometimes characterized as the functional components of God. Sometimes they are regarded as archangels that are responsible for regulating the affairs of the universe. Out of the 10, 5 are important here. The 5 major deities are Adomo, Benikurukuru, Egbesu, Kalasuo, Oruama, and Amakri or Kiriogbo. These deities are responsible for maintaining the natural order of the world. So if the natural order as created by God is disturbed, one or more of these powerful beings will react to restore order. They do so by manifesting among some Ijaw people to take up action to correct or remove the abnormality if possible. Consequently, it was believed by some Ijaws that the oil war of 1998-2009 was instigated by the God of justice, peace, and war to compel Ijaw youths to act militarily to restore the natural order. Henry Upukame, an advocate of resource control, stated, and I quote, "What happened was that the god of war of the Ijaw nation propelled most of us into agitation for resource control, self-determination, and appropriate political space. I unquote. Therefore, the Ijaws have a holy war practice in which they fight under the direction of God to restore the natural order of things. This is why they become sacred warriors, because they are fighting for God's order. When a fighter dies while fighting for justice, it is believed that the person's soul would be energized and deified. This implies that the soul of the person could be invoked to manifest and assist the Ijaws during a war. Now, let's look at some of the names of Ijaw war deities. 1. Egbesu is the Ijaw national god of justice, peace, and war. So Egbesu is just not god of war, no. It is first justice and then peace before war. Thus, Egbesu is the Urukari equivalent of St. Michael in Christianity and Islam. It is one of the 10 major Ijaw national deities that are responsible for creating and regulating the affairs of the earth based on God's rule. Egbesu is regarded as the god of war because to ensure justice and peace, it is sometimes necessary to fight in order to eradicate injustice, evil, and the violation of the natural order of things in the world. It can only be invoked to ensure justice, truth, and peace. It cannot be invoked to cause harm or evil. And that is very important. Egbesu cannot be used for aggressive war. Egbesu is so sacred that it can only be invoked by those with pure hearts. Anyone who has committed evil or engaged in an abominable act cannot invoke it. To avoid instigating the wrath of Egbesu, Ijaw people are encouraged at all times to avoid engaging in sinful behavior. Egbesu cannot be invoked to fight a war of aggression. All Ijaws are automatically subjected to the spiritual power of Egbesu and can invoke it to ensure justice if they are clean. Now, apart from Egbesu, then each ethnic or sub-ethnic group or clan also has a god of war. Here, I just list but a few. So, the subnational war deities are the gods of war at the clan level. This means that each Ijaw sub-ethnic group or clan has its own god of war apart from Egbesu and other major deities. So let's see. For Andoni is Yok Obolo. In Boni it is Ikuba. It is Fenibeso in Okreka. Kulukuma Egbesi for Kulukuma. Egbesu for Arogbo and Baramatu. Ogidiga and Kola Oruwe in Nembe and Okpoma. Okpolodo in Kalabari. Ibazo in Ogbia. Note, please, take note. The above list only represents a tiny fraction of the war deities at the clan level. Almost every Ijaw clan or sub-ethnic group has a war deity. War institutions. In this section, the institutions that are devoted to initiating, training, and mobilizing people for war are examined. Indeed, it is not possible to organize, fight a war, and win without some degree of organization and preparation. Therefore, in Ijaw land, the institutions devoted to organizing, preparing, and mobilizing for war are very important. 1. Sacred warrior societies. Generally, among the Ijaws, due to the importance of consultation with the ancestors and deities to justify the necessity for engaging in war, sacred war societies permit the ethnicity. Thus, to fight a war using both physical and spiritual means, it is necessary to be initiated into warrior societies. Each society, whether at the community or clan level, has its stringent rules that initiates must follow in order to receive protective services of the deities. Thus, the sacred societies, especially the one associated with Egbesu and other major clan entities, are responsible for setting the rules that lead to the Ijaw Just War Doctrine. Why? Because to fight based on Egbesu's spirituality, it is necessary to be pure in heart and fight by following strict rules. A violation of the rules leads to the forfeiture of the protective umbrella of the deities. This means that those who have engaged in abominable acts cannot be initiated to Egbesu and many other secret war societies, except they confess and do spiritual cleansing. Among the Kulukma people during the pre-colonial period, male children were initiated as soon as they developed their first tooth the right way. When that happens, the children were taken to the war shrine and initiated. After initiation, they were treated as adults symbolically, even though they were still very young children. So, if you are a male child in Kolokuma, the moment you were initiated, you were treated like an adult by your mother and others. 2. Land and marine warfare components. The Ijaw warrior tradition has both land and marine components. The marine component uses war canoes. In both cases, the fighters must be spiritually clean in order to participate. In particular, anyone who has committed an abomination cannot participate in the war canoe because it is a very sacred experience where spiritual possession sometimes takes place to lead the canoe to its destination. In the oil war of the early 2000s, Ijaw fighters used speedboats that were adorned with spiritual symbols and flags. So they replaced the ordinary canoe with the speedboats, but the purpose was still the same. Now, this is a traditional Ijaw war canoe. Again, this is a traditional war canoe. This is a modern war canoe. This was what the oil war fighters used, fast speedboats, but the principle still resemble the traditional war canoe. Again, this is a fast moving speedboat, but it's still a war canoe. So the Ijaws are very creative. Religious priests and priestesses. To be initiated into the secret warrior society, potential fighters must be initiated by religious priests and or priestesses after they have been declared of any spiritual impurity. Osanware. Before actually going to fight, the fighters might go into the war house or shrine for prayer, invocation of the deities, and pouring of libation. At this stage, some fighters could begin to experience spiritual possession and even see into the battle before the battle actually begins. War dance. The Ijaws have elaborate war dances. The beating of war drums and singing of war songs sometimes arouse spiritual possession. Spiritual possession. Some people believe that it is at this stage that invisibility to bullets or any harm can take place, since the deities are now fully involved in sanctifying the fighters. War costumes. Both pre-colonial and modern Ijaw fighters are dressed in military attire that is designed to frighten the enemy to flee. Sometimes they rub certain chalk around their eyes and faces. They also tie a piece of cloth either on their arms or forehead to indicate the spiritual colors. Again, journalist Sebastian Junger of Vanity Fair described the appearance of men fighters as, and I quote, "they were a collection of walking nightmares, everything that is terrifying to the human psyche." Generally, the war canoes are decorated with palm fronds and flags with different colors indicating a spiritual sanctification. Now, coming to the conclusion, using the globalized concept of just war doctrine to analyze the Ijaw war principle, rules, and practices indicate that the Ijaws have reached just war doctrine which they continue to perpetuate today, even though the nature of warfare has changed with modern military technology. As indicated above, due to the spirituality of their culture, they cannot fight without paying considerable attention to the rules which guide their war effort. Therefore, they have principles, rules, and practices of war that are compatible with the globalized concept of jus ad bellum and jus in bello. This fact is attested to by the presentation which breaks down the Ijaw rules and practices into the two major categories of the international just war doctrine. Some people might not agree and insist that the Ijaws are militarily aggressive. If that is the case, the Ijaws would not have waited for over 5 decades before they had a state, Bayelsa, in Nigeria, even though they were one of the earliest ethnic groups to demand the creation of states. They spent decades pleading with Nigeria to develop their territory the way it develops other parts of the country to no avail. Even after contributing so much in terms of oil wealth to Nigeria, the Ijaws are still patiently pleading for an equitable distribution of the oil wealth. It is no secret that the oil wealth that emanates from the Niger Delta is controlled and dominated by Nigerians from the non-oil producing regions. Even the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, which is now the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation Limited, is dominated by people from the non-oil producing regions. The entire oil region is heavily polluted, yet the Ijaws continue to plead with Nigeria to clean the region instead of resorting to war. They fight when they are pushed to the wall. When that happens, they utilize all their physical and spiritual capabilities to do so. Indeed, the Ijaws have been patient because of their just war doctrine due to their religion. This presentation focuses on principles and practices that constitute Ijaw Just War Doctrine. However, this does not mean that there were no aggressive wars that took place during the pre-colonial, colonial, and after British colonialism, just like in any other society. It must also be stated that there were several intra-ethnic and inter-ethnic wars that took place during various historical periods. Despite these wars, there is no denying the fact that the Ijaws have elaborate principles, rules, and practices concerning fighting a justifiable war. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Please subscribe to the channel and listen to other very interesting presentations. Again, thank you very much.